Hi, well, I'm Simon Bridges, and welcome to another Business Insights webinar. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to have Louise Broekman talk to us about advisory boards. Louise is an award-winning entrepreneur, researcher, business advisor, and founder of the professional body for the advisory board sector, with industry and government recognition for her contribution to the business sector. Louise has the advantage of having been on both sides of the table in the shoes of a founder and that of a chair of multiple advisory boards. Louise recognised firsthand how a well-run advisory board can positively impact CEOs and the business at large. Upon exiting her multinational business, Louise led international research and served as chair for commercial advisory boards. As founder of the Advisory Board Centre, operating in over 25 countries, Louise also leads the Global Research Council and is an in-demand speaker regularly called upon as the leading voice for advisory boards globally. Louise, welcome.
Thanks, Simon. Lovely to be here.
Hey, well, I was saying to you off air, I've been on one or two advisory boards, so I'm keenly interested in this. We have a reasonably significant SME audience that will be interested also because, of course, this is something they could do, and in appropriate circumstances would do, I think. So we're all ears. We'd love to hear from you and get your thoughts and advice on advisory boards.
That's great, Simon. So I might share with you the findings of the global market report and some of the trends, and maybe talk some of those things through with you, Simon, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, so what I might do is I might just start and share my screen, do a little bit of a show and tell to start with, and then keep it as conversational as we possibly can. So again, appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation about advisory boards, where they're impactful and when they're not. The State of the Market report is a market report that gets produced every second year on what's happening in the advisory board sector globally. So the last report was produced in 2023 and through to 2025. So the Advisory Board Centre, just as a bit of an overview of who we are and what we're not, we're the global professional body for the advisory board sector. So what the Institute of Directors do in New Zealand, what they do for governance board directors, we do that same function for the advisory board sector, but globally. We're the only professional body in the world. And our key role is to really raise the standard of advisory boards. So, if you're going to have an advisory board from a really simple function to a more complex one, just make sure it's really impactful, but then also safe from a governance perspective, but also for the personal brands and reputation of everybody being involved. Our key role is research, education, professional development, and advocacy across the world for the advisory board sector. I started the Advisory Board Centre because I had an advisory board for my previous business in 2005, and it was life changing. So it's not a secret around I'm probably the most biased person you would meet around advisory boards, but we had the opportunity to really grow that particular business internationally, and I was making decisions as a small business owner and going, is that a good decision? I don't know, but I'm going to make that anyway. And I really felt at that time that just wasn't good enough. I wanted to have a business I was really proud of. I wanted to feel confident and I wanted to feel safe as well. So I thought, I'm going to build an advisory board. I really didn't know what one was, but I knew I needed to have good people around me, but I didn't want to lose control of the decisions for my own business. So it changed my life because in 5 years, we built that business to 135 offices in 8 countries. I then sold that business, and I come from an intellectual property and research and development background, Simon. So I decided to research, test, and validate advisory board structures around the world because if that can do that for me, what can it do for other people? In that process, we're able to really identify what are really quality advisory boards, what aren't. quality? What are the ethical boundaries between a governance board and advisory board? What's the difference between an internal executive and a consultant? And in that process of understanding and building best practice, we found that there was no professional body looking after the advisory board sector at all around the world. So we decided to stop being a player and actually be the stewards of best practice, and create a global community of advisory board professionals, of which I'm really happy to say there's a growing quality advisory board sector happening in New Zealand right now. So I'm very excited to be coming over soon to really work with our members there. What I'd like to do is just briefly look at what are the key trends that are happening in the advisory board sector, what's happening with professionals, and what's happening in the market, and particularly the business sector with advisory boards. So advisory boards are not it's not a governance board. They're quite different. I'll go through that in a moment. But Corn Ferry and Financial Times both referred to our market report, and stated that was the hot new governance trend. Now, advisory boards is not a governance board, but it's actually really impacting quality governance in a way of creating a governance system and stronger governance inside organisations. And what are the two things that are driving that? Is the one, and the most important one is that in the past there were conversations around, is it a governance board or is it an advisory board? And that's a very old conversation now. It's now talking about and advisory boards working alongside governance boards to really inform leadership and creating now a system of governance. So we don't necessarily just talk about governance boards, we talk about governance systems, because governance is just getting much more complex and bigger as a responsibility. And I'll just explain that. And all of us as business owners or as executives really see that governance board directors are increasingly becoming constrained. There's a lot more regulations, and you can go to jail for the decisions that you make or not make as a director. But the things that we need to cover and be across is so much bigger. So the agenda is getting bigger. So how do you cover off on everything that you need to know and need to make decisions around as a director? Do you work harder? Do you bring on more directors? Do you have longer meetings, which everybody doesn't want to do? Do you bring in specialist employees, consultants, or do you build advisory boards? Or do you wing it and hopefully no one notices that the poor decisions are being poorly informed, and so advisory boards are really coming into play in creating a governance system to support directors in making more informed and more confident decisions. The other thing is in the market today is just stakeholder economy. So stakeholders needing to be engaged more regularly in the way that decisions are being made, and that affects things like customer advisory boards. We see in the aged care sector at the moment, Simon, where advisory boards have been regulated in the aged care sector, where a vulnerable customer has to have a voice. And this is, I think, is a really important trend for any organisation that might have a vulnerable customer. The advisory board sector itself, like who are advisory board professionals? In 2019, there were 1.3 million advisory board professionals around the world. In 2023, there were over 2.6 million, which means it's more than doubled, and it's getting stronger and being utilised more around the world. The US is the largest market using advisory boards, followed by the UK, European zone, then Asia, and then Australia and New Zealand make up 4%, which is about right given the size of our economies for the Australia New Zealand zone. So the adaptation of best practice, though, in Australia and New Zealand is very strong, and in some ways leading the rest of the world with regards to quality advisory boards that I think our region should be really, really proud of. Where do advisory boards sit, though, we think about ourselves in business, where do we get advice from? Because it comes in so many different forms, from informal through to formal. So informally, we get advice from our family and friends, whether we want it or not. They're going to give it to us since the day we were born. Then in business, it's really handy connecting in with other business owners, where we talk about peers in business, and then also business network groups. Like you think about the chamber, Simon, of how
Mm,
entrepreneurs and business owners getting together and creating that peer support. When people talk about it's lonely in business, the work that chambers do are really important in that socialization of advice. Then you get the one-to-one engagement, accountants, business coach, mentor, consultant, or individual expert advisors, where it's that one-to-one engagement. Where this gets problematic, especially in the business sector, is that when we build a relationship with an external advisor or consultant, is that sometimes as business owners, we have the expectation that one person will have the answer to everything for our business, because there's so much trust really created in that relationship. In turn, advisors sometimes get conflicted because say, you've asked me to give you advice on that. That's actually not my area of expertise, but I'm going to go there because I just want to help. And so that becomes the ethical issue of grey, of when advice should be provided and when it shouldn't. Now, advisory boards then come into the next level of formality, where there's a charter, there's an independent chair, there are external advisors being chosen fit for the priorities of what that business is looking to achieve, and then they measure impact. Generally, advisory boards will meet 4 times a year. That's most common practice. Then you get the full governance board, where you have a board of directors, and it's the most serious undertaking with regards to advice, and rightly so. It's binding on the directors, where they can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made at the governance board table, but then it's also binding on the organisation or the business to implement those decisions that have been made. Generally, though, the market are really not clear about the difference between a governance board and advisory board. So the simplest definition is, and the simplest is always the best, I think, but a governance board is a decision-making model and it's binding. An advisory board does not make decisions. They're a problem-solving model and a thinking system. So the decisions stay with the organisation. And so this is the great thing about advisory boards, is that you can have a really robust, diverse conversation that informs leaders in the decisions that they make. And so I think that's a really important distinction. Advisory boards, though, are not one size fits all. And again, going from informal to formal, there are so many variations to the way that advisory boards work, because largely they're not regulated or legislated, and that flexibility is its strength. And so this really helps businesses of all sizes to be able to engage with advisory boards and really make it fit for purpose, and they grow up and really scale their governance and their confidence in their decision making over time. So informally, you have informal advisory boards where business owners might chair their own advisory board, don't pay people, and for startups and scale ups, that can potentially be a good model, but it's not a good long-term model, because things get conflicted over time. On-demand advice panels are really great for investment groups as well as accelerators, where they pre-select an advisor panel and they use them on demand, really flexible and really agile, which is great. Peer advisory boards are very common in the market, where you might have a group of entrepreneurs or business owners around the table, and there's one chair, and business owners get together on a monthly basis and provide that real mutual support to each other. Then you have advisory boards that are really specifically for one business, where you might start with having an advisory board of one, recruiting a chair that works with the business on a monthly basis, for a period of time, and then as that model matures, the advisory board of one convert into a pop-up advisory board, where you bring in experts or advisors as you need them. So they pop in and they pop out. The really exciting part of the market today, great return on investment, a project advisory board. So majority of new advisory boards, 53% of them actually, are now project advisory boards. So they're not just an advisory board about everything, they're about a specific topic, which might be like commercialization of a new idea, entering a new market, focusing on digital transformation or sustainability, or navigating geopolitical risk in an external market. So these are really great. So it could be a 3-month advisory board when it's never forever. So it has a job to do, job is done, it gets dismantled. So really great return on investment in these models. And then you've got the best practice advisory board, which is an all of business advisory board that may be working on an ongoing basis, but they refresh every year, really evaluating if their priorities have changed and their advisory board members rotate as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in the way that advisory boards can work today that really suit different needs, but also different budgets as well. I look at the key trends across project advisory boards in the business sector and corporate advisory boards. The emerging market, and it'd be good to get a view of these with your membership, Simon. But emerging markets are generally pre-revenue through to 1.5 million in revenue turnover. About 29% of advisory boards are actually in this part of the market, which is important. There's a high level of volatility, so very simple advisory board structures really work in this market because they need a lot of flexibility to be able to change and shift then as their needs actually evolve. Then you get the business market, the 1.5 to $100 million revenue turnover. That's a big range, but it's broken down into a lot of subsets like 1.5 to 10 million, 10 to 30, 30 to 50, 50 to 100. They're all very different in the way that their advisory board sort of priorities and scope really work. But what's really interesting is the most common starting point for an advisory board in this market. It's actually quite small, between 1 to 1.5 million in revenue turnover. And generally they'll invest between $40,000 to $70,000 for their advisory board in their first year. Now that could make up an independent chair and having 2 external advisors on that advisory board. So it's a really good investment model in bringing the outside in and getting really quality advisory board members who are really fit for what your business is, what your priorities are for your business and what you're trying to achieve, and really carefully selecting those members. Corporate advisory boards is when you've got large organisations like governments, like universities or multinationals, building advisory boards within their broader ecosystem of governance, and they are very project specific. So it might be around customer advisory boards, cyber, mergers and acquisitions, innovation, navigating supply chain and sustainability. They're just as an example, but what's happening in this part of the market is that it's really formalising internal management functions inside a large organisation, like the role of a secretariat or an advisory board manager, and the role of an independent professional chair. So this is actually a big shift in the market that's happening all around the world. Project advisory boards, as I mentioned, is 53% of advisory boards today, and it's so agile and it's exciting. And I think this will be the future of advisory boards, and really good return on investment models because they are super focused, really sharp and time bound. And as I mentioned, they're never forever. So they don't run out of steam either. Best practice is important. This is where our function as the professional body really comes into play. We've been operating now for 7.5 years around the world. What was a game changer in the advisory board sector was the development and the ongoing development of the ABF 101 Advisory Board Best Practice Framework. So you can't have best practice standards actually in advisory boards because there's no one way that advisory boards work. So instead of having best practice standards, we have best practice principles to enable advisory boards to be able to apply best practice and make it fit for purpose, because the way an advisory board operates in a startup or a scale up is different to how it works in the business or a corporate environment. So these principles can be applied in whatever environment to make sure it's really fit for the environments that it's in. But when businesses in particular say, I want an advisory board, they go straight to thinking about, who am I going to get? It's actually the last thing that needs to be considered. The first thing that's really important to really ascertain is, what is our purpose and how do we get clarity of the scope? What's the advisory board here to do? What is it not here to do? Then work out what structure could really work given this stage and the environment that we're in. So what's the structure and discipline? That doesn't mean constraint. The simpler the advisory board model is, the better it is. But what's the structure that would really help drive that strategy, and how are we going to measure the impact to make sure that it's really achieving what it's set out to do, and a good return on investment model specifically for the business sector. Then lastly, who are the people? Who are the internal representatives, and who are going to be independent? How are we going to bring the outside in? Who are they? Are they independent of the organisation, and are they independent of each other, to make sure that you're not being consulted to, because consulting is very different to advice, and making sure that they're fit for the kind of conversation, so that their input is absolutely relevant for what the business or the organisation is going through. So the best practice framework is a free resource for everybody to be able to access, to really understand what those frameworks are and how they can be applied. So Simon, I'm just going to stop sharing screen there. I hope I didn't go for too long on that.
No, fantastic. You've left me wanting more, which is, I think we want in sales, isn't it? It's fantastic to know that there's the likes of you and that advice around advisory boards. I suppose a first question, I think, there's a lot in this, but people love a human face on this. You said right at the start that this was life-changing for you. What sort of business did you have at that point in time, and how was an advisory board so helpful to you in your business journey growing? I forget the numbers, but from small to big.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's nothing better than a success story built on tragedy. So, so my tragic story was in seems it's 20 years ago now. I can't believe it. But we built a software package. The business was professional services,
Right,
outsourced HR to the small and medium sized business sector.
right,
And we built a software package, and we took it to market in 2004. And this is way back in ancient history, Simon, when you used to load up a CD. And it's a bit like the great Zero used to be a CD too, the great New Zealand story. So it's like the Zero for human resources way back then.
right.
And I misjudged going to market. We ended up with thousands of businesses over time using that software, but not in the beginning. And so the take up in the market was slower than I'd actually anticipated. And so I had to sell everything that I owned to keep that business going. And you never ever forget that moment
Mm,
of doing that. That's
mm,
commitment.
mm.
And it's sort of environment where you don't want to be in that situation again. So a year later, we were on solid ground and we had the opportunity to really grow that business globally. And there were a few things that happened, Simon. One is I had nothing left to sell. So if I didn't execute well on that strategy, it was problematic. The other thing is we had this incredible opportunity to do really good work with this business, and I really wanted to be proud of this business that I was leading, and I wanted to step up. So for me to step up, I needed accountability partners to be able to say, if you said you're going to do that, we expect you to do it, but not only do it, but do it well. And I chose advisory board members on that advisory board that I really deeply admired and respected, so that I felt that sense of responsibility, not only to myself, but also for their reputation. They're putting their personal brand and reputation
mm,
and backing me. And I thought, I'm
mm,
so honored for them to be able to do that. So it gave me that sense of responsibility to do well. Um, and that really held me to account. But at the same time, I didn't lose control of my business because I didn't have a board of directors. They were advisory board members, and
yeah,
whatever advice they provided me was not binding. So I could take
yeah,
their advice and take it or leave it, but deeply consider it and defend the decisions I was making. But I had this opportunity to really road test, and have that sounding board to really test the edges of something that I was going to commit to and actually invest in. So having working capital is one thing, but having investment capital is another story because you've got to back yourself.
mm,
So we know, we did a study on 400 businesses and the impact of their advisory board.
mm,
How did the advisory boards have an impact on those 400 businesses? They had overall, it was a 15% upswing in their financial results. But you know, the biggest result was a 30% impact on people feeling 30% more confident in the
mm,
decisions they were making
mm,
because they had this sounding board in the
yeah,
decisions that they were making.
yeah,
Now that is not a business financial result. That's a result about how someone feels on the
mm,
inside. So this is, I think, from a business sector point of view, the importance of advisory boards is not in the business market, is not only the business results, but also the well-being and the vulnerability of a business owner making decisions on their own.
fantastic. You may have answered this, Louise, but I'm interested. You mentioned earlier on, you used the word safe a handful of times. Explain to me what you sort of mean by that in terms of what's safe about business, about advisory boards for business founders, and what's safe about this from a governor's or the advisor's perspective, the advisory board, as opposed to sort of maybe some other models and the fully fledged kind of governance, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. It, being a business owner, you're always vulnerable because you've got everything on the line every day. You and your family are uh, uh, really bound by that. And so to be vulnerable is really tricky. You can't be vulnerable in front of employees, or it's very difficult to be. And you don't want to take that vulnerability home either. So, where is it that you can have the conversation with a group of people, not just one, but a group of people to be able to say, you know what, I'm actually really struggling here. This is the whole conversation too. Should advisory boards be recorded or not? We need these safe zones where people are allowed to
Mm,
be vulnerable to figure things out.
mm,
And you can't have that vulnerability in different environments, or if you do, it's just really, really hard.
yeah,
And also people on an advisory board too. Um, they're not there to judge, they're there to understand and to really support.
yes,
Now, it's really tricky having that conversation with one person because you're expecting one person to have all the answers, and that's not fair. And so it also creates safety for those advisory board members to be thinking together for
mm,
everyone to problem solve about the whatever it is that's what's next. Now, advisory boards are not there because you want to maintain business as usual. Advisory boards are because you're actually wanting to push the boundary
yeah,
and do something different with what's next, which
yeah,
means that the business model will be pressurized somewhere, and we think about the future, we're all making it up because none of us have been there. So, whatever expertise that you're calling on, it's not for someone to say, I recommend that you should do that, right? Um, no one is an expert in this environment. Some people have specialization absolutely to call on, but they themselves have not been in your situation and being able to put it into context with your business. So all of us need to be putting more emphasis on problem solving. So we're making really good, confident decisions that potentially is different to the way that we've made decisions before.
Yeah.
So vulnerability is really, really important. But for everyone to be vulnerable, to have that conversation that no one's ever had before, we need a safe zone to be able to do that.
Yeah, I know I'm putting you in a spot. I hate it when people ask me for specific examples, but I suppose if you can think of any, I mean, just an example of where a business advisory a board has gone really well. Something to give us a sense of, yeah, no, that's I can hold on to that. And then maybe, I mean, can you think of some examples where it hasn't gone well or it's been suboptimal in the particular context?
Yeah, yeah. So we've got a lot of case studies, and one of the methodologies that our chairs use is an assessment when they establish an advisory board, and they use that assessment every 6 months or 12 months to measure the impact of the advisory board and whether the priorities have changed. So it's all about alignment. It's called the business growth score. It's a fantastic method, very simple but really effective. And in that measurement, it really looks at where the impact has been. And so there are many case studies in that 1.5 to 10 million, 10 to 30, 30 to 50, 50 to 100, where advisory boards have impact on the business results, but also for the life of the business owner, for the business. In one of the key areas is the business ability to operate without you. So that is a key area. Now, we do know, though, that not all advisory boards are successful. And so that study that we did on 400 businesses, 10% of businesses in that sample they actually had a negative result. And what we found, the common characteristic of those businesses is that those businesses were dealing with a cash flow crisis at the time when they engaged their advisory board.
Right.
So an advisory board is not the answer to everything. So if you've got a cash flow crisis, then paying advisory board members and expecting them
Yep.
to solve the problem for you,
Yep.
it's not the right mechanism for that kind of environment. So what's important is to really carefully evaluate what's our situation and what kind of model do we need, because sometimes you do need a stronger governance board or a more effective governance board. Sometimes you need advisory boards, sometimes you need consultants or a lawyer to
Yeah.
fix an issue
Yeah.
before you actually start looking at the longer term view.
Got it. Yeah, I think what's very powerful is that there's just it's real spectrum of advisory boards, and I've heard you at the really bigger end of town, if you like. There's these project advisory boards that might be on, a particular, a move into another country, or a particular ESG issue, and then finite timetable on that, and the like. There'll be all manner of people watching this, Louise, but a bunch of them will be, I've no doubt, small and medium-sized businesses, and just in that regard, I suppose a couple of specific questions. One is, uh, should they be viewing this as a get out of jail card on legal issues around proper is the wrong word, but formal governance boards? Is it a sort of a try this before you buy the proper thing, or is that overly simplistic?
It could be a try before you buy.
Yeah.
So that way, both the professional advisor who could potentially become a future director is able to really assess whether the fit is right and whether it's safe for them, but also for the organisation itself. An advisory board never uh, replaces the responsibility for a director to know their business and their decision making. So it's not a cop out. So it's not a get out of jail free card for the directors. For advisory board professionals, there still is a liability. Some advisory boards are riskier than others. So you
Right.
get these specialist advisory boards that might be around cyber or hydrogen or navigating
Right.
geopolitical risk. Their specialization then puts that advisory board potentially at higher risk. But if they're not making
Right.
decisions and you've got really good, robust protocols around it, it makes it a
Yes.
safer environment. Yeah.
Yes.
The other thing too is for emerging businesses that are scaling, advisory boards become a great way to scale your governance and actually learn governance in a safe way for new
Yes.
directors.
Yes.
I used to chair an advisory board where we had two, younger directors on that in that business, and then we had that advisory board for 18 months to really support them as a way, as a professional development and capability development exercise for those directors. So that was a really exciting purpose
Yeah.
for us to really guide them in building their confidence as directors.
Fantastic. And more generally, and I appreciate it, it is, we're dealing in generalizations, but if we're talking about those sort of, I don't know, sub 10 million or 15 million dollar companies, that are real sort of small or medium sized businesses, but maybe they're an exciting startup and they want some help with that scaling. What do you say? Yeah, well, I suppose, what are you, as a generalization, what would you say, when would you say, that small, medium-sized business that isn't too big should be considering an advisory board, or you could or should be?
Yeah, yeah. Well, generally it's because they're really, it will generally be a trigger point to start with of
Right.
we want something that's different for what's next. Now, when we look at the business sector, it's about bringing the outside in. So the smaller the business might be fulfilling a capability gap that's sitting inside the business. The other is to be able to really inform that strategy by having that specialization in. Then, so the primary motivation to have an advisory board in the business market is because businesses want to grow. The
Yep.
second is succession planning.
Right.
So this becomes a really important thing for Australian and New Zealand businesses with regards
Definitely.
to family businesses and succession
Yeah.
planning, but also the maturing of the business models of family businesses into a family office and into an investment hub. Um, Increasingly, though, businesses are having advisory boards because they need to navigate a really complicated or a complex environment, just navigating today. So the market's changing on them, but we haven't changed internally. How do we do that? And so this is new, and that's only really happened in the last 2 years. And I think, the level of complexity that all of us are dealing with, if we're going to navigate, do we sell the business? Do we exit? Do we prepare for exit? If we scale, how do we scale? If we go into international markets, do we need an advisory board in that market to help us protect our asset in that market? And so the profile is actually shifting not only from growth, it's not only growth now, it's also a way to how do we manage the risk and manage the complexity of an environment. So Simon, you've been involved on advisory boards too. What have been some of those sort of
Mm.
environments you've been in?
One was and I take your point that it cuts both ways. For me, they were, I suppose, the start of my governance journey, and before, going on, even more formal governance boards. I think in one case, I'm trying to remember what the order was, but it was a really exciting AI business, and I certainly didn't come with AI expertise, but I had some other skills and experiences that were helpful to the business. And it was a chance for that business trying to really grow, be international, to be thinking about some of the things that it needed, getting some good information and advice. And it was a very exciting period for the business. In the others, I think, in the other case, it was a business that was more conventional, if you like, but it had quite a lot of success. It got to a certain size where it was, much more at the M than the S end of SME, and was, looking at, what next? How do we kind of take our next jump? What does the founder do around this? They weren't, thinking about retiring, but should be they stepping back or moving sideways, having a CE, all of these sort of things. And so that was the journey there. And I think in both cases, in the round, advisory boards were a better fit than a full governance board. It just, yeah, it was much more of, as you say, a not decision making, just helping to guide, inform, give perspective, bounce around where the business was and where it was going. So that was my experience. Now I was going to say sadly, I don't have sadly. Now they're all proper legal governance boards that as you say are different again. One
Yeah.
question I've got, for you is I suppose in kind of closing, but is tell us about why you're in New Zealand and what you're up to.
Yeah, I'm so looking forward to coming into New Zealand, to Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch, and ending up in Queenstown. So as you do, um, um, we have an incredible advisory board community in New Zealand. So to be able to be there on the ground, supporting them in the good work that they're doing, talking with different organisations about the role of advisory boards, and having that broader conversation with the Institute of Directors, different business groups, startups, scale ups, and accelerator programs. It's around really having the ear to the ground for me, because I'm there to learn, not only just to talk at the market. I really want to listen to the market, so that we really put it into context what's really important for New Zealand businesses and organisations, and what's the critical thinking that needs to be put around the future decision making that's going to drive the New Zealand economy. So I really want to be there to listen and to learn, to support our really great advisory board community, and the certified chairs in market, in the good work that they're doing, and supporting them in any way that I can.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure we publicise a bit of that as well. And we really appreciate your time and your expertise on this. I think fascinating, and actually, as you say, hot trend for all the right reasons. And we wish you well while you're in New Zealand.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it, Simon.